This video provides an overview of our quick reference guide on writing ACI code requirements. And so our basic code language, this is not all encompassing. This is just a portion, I think, that hits the highlights that will resolve a large portion of the things you may encounter in writing code, particularly if you're a new code committee member. So our technical committee manual, or TCM, is always the first place to go. And in this case, chapter 5 is your critical resource. It has got a lot of examples on formatting down into the very detailed pieces of this, language, organization, and it may be good. Everybody on the code committee should take a look at this chapter and read it, but it also might be good to have someone on the code committee do a deep dive and serve as kind of a reference person for this as you're going through language. The specific chapters and sections that you're required to have in code requirement documents is given in the TCM, and there's quite a few examples, as I said. ACI 318 is a good one to look for to see other examples outside of those just covered in the TCM of the concepts that are outlined there. So I'm going to hit just a couple of key points that I think are the most common pieces of confusion, as well as some of the most common ones that you'll see time and time again. A couple key points here. Design codes are specifically written for the licensed design professional, which sometimes you'll hear the engineer or the engineer of record, but the term we use is licensed design professional, LDP, and that's what should be used in your code language. Definitions just shown here, that's shown in ACI 318. And I've included it here because it also is a great example of the two-column format that we use in our codes. Now note that when you write the code as a committee, you don't need to use the two-column format. That happens in the publication process. And you don't need to put a lot of detail into your formatting because that's handled through a separate software program and is not directly taken from your Word formatting. So you might have the full section of code and then the full section of commentary following that, but the way it appears in our published documents is alongside. This two-column format has all of our code on the left. The left side is the mandatory language. Okay, this is the code language that I'm talking about in this document. The commentary isn't required for every code provision. It's used to support the code, and it gives additional details and descriptions. Highlighted a little bit of the types of things you'll see in commentary and the types of things you shouldn't see in commentary in this overview, but there's a lot more detail in the TCM. This is more of an overview that you may want to print out or have handy electronically when you're writing up new code or evaluating some of the code and commentary you already have in your document. All right, so each code provision has to have a single requirement and it has to be in mandatory language. So on this left-hand side, I don't want a list of requirements, or a bunch of different requirements smashed together. Think of it as the single mandatory requirement, and thus I need to use language that's mandatory. Okay, so we typically will use the verb shall, and it's the most used one in most of our code documents. Permissive verbs like should or may could be used in the commentary, but those are not mandatory language. So this is why you'll see shall over and over again on the code side. You want to use, and likewise, you shouldn't be using shall on the commentary side. That is not a mandatory language side. So you'll be using the should and some of those more permissive verbs on the commentary side as you explain the code piece. You want to use real precise language. Okay, so the TCM goes through the exact examples, and I encourage you to take a look at that. But you only use adjectives if they're needed to achieve precision for the noun that they're modifying. So if I have the phrase axial force, axial is telling me which type of force. On the other hand, if I use an average of appropriate force or significant distance, things like this, those are kind of weaselly adjectives. They are imprecise for code language, and they don't provide the information that the LDP needs on a mandatory requirement. So consider the difference between something that says appropriately spaced reinforcement, for instance, versus maximum spacing shall be 18 inches. Okay, so appropriate is unenforceable, and that should not be seen on the code size. But maximum spacing at 18 inches is very specific. And in this case, I don't need to have additional explanation of the word spacing. What does that mean? Is that clear, center to center? Because the word spacing refers to center distance. So you have to also be specific on your defined terms. So this is a good place to look at the TCM and understand when I need certain adjectives to be specific about my language. All right. So in other words, in this case, if I was looking to distance between element edges, right, then I need to have clear modifying spacing so that I have clear spacing. All right, so these seem like picky things, but they're really important because, of course, this is mandatory. So once these code requirements are adopted into a model code and then by a jurisdiction, we want this language to be clear and enforceable. All right. For compliance phrases, this is another place to look at the TCM, but just to give you a flavor of this, you want to, for material requirements, use the words conform to instead of satisfy or in accordance with. But for design actions or design selections, you're going to use in accordance with instead of satisfy or conform to or shall provide. So if you're working on a design code, these are the types of things you're looking at. If you're looking at material requirements, you'll be looking at what's in Part A. Again, go to the TCM, and it has some great examples in this area. Finally, the commentary. The commentary, so the code has to be able to stand alone and be usable without the commentary. Only the code is the one that's adopted and enforceable, not the commentary. So what does the commentary do? This provides guidance, which includes, an explanation or why the provision is there, references, or other information you want to support the code provision. It sometimes has a discussion highlighting new provisions, and those should not just stay forever. They should be removed during the next cycle of the code. And so that'll be something to look at if you're in charge of a section of code and commentary, that you take a look at anything that was added with a new provision the previous cycle, if that can be removed now. The commentary has to be careful not to interpret the code in a way that conflicts with the language of the code. So this includes figures. So if a figure or table is in contradiction to the code language, that's not okay. It can support, but it can't be in contradiction. Commentary should, and this is one that tends to be tempting, the commentary shouldn't repeat the code provision. Okay, it shouldn't have additional requirements. So anything that's enforceable and required needs to be on the code side as individual separate provisions, and shouldn't be repeating the direct language. So I see that happen a lot of times, and just point it out and pull that out of the commentary. It also the commentary should not provide design aids or specific examples. There's a different place for that outside our code and commentary. We may have manuals that go through example problems or case studies. It also shouldn't provide general education. In other words, when you hear someone say, that sounds like textbook material, that shouldn't be in the commentary. Okay, that goes in the textbooks. And the commentary shouldn't use mandatory language. Okay, a couple other kind of high-level items. When you refer to other sections, you don't use an descriptor. In other words, if I want to refer back to section 1.10.1, I just say in accordance with, and the section is assumed. The exception to that is if you're starting a sentence, then you go ahead and say section XYZ, right? All right, and then one other big one, when to use the code and this code. So this confuses a lot of people. On the code side, use this code because I'm on the code, I'm talking about this code, and think of the commentary as, it's almost a separate document. It's alongside to help describe things, but it's not the code. So in the commentary, I'm going to say the code. In other words, that code that's over there to the left in that column, that's the code. All right. So on the code side, you use this code because it's the code itself. And in the commentary, you use the code. Okay. When you are referring to a code that's not the current document or another any other document, then you use a specific number. So ACI code, what have you. So if I'm in 318 and I'm referring to 318, I say this code. If I'm in the code side of 318 and I'm in the, actually it'd be in the commentary side. So if I'm in the commentary side and I'm referring to a document that's not 318, I'm going to write ACI code or specification, whatever it is, and the actual number. All right, in chapter 3, where I have my references for standards, use the most recent published version. For example, in 318, I'm recording this in 2025, and the most recent is ACI 318, code 318.25. When I cite it in the code or commentary, I don't use the date. Okay, so I just say ACI 318. That will get you through the majority of usage of how you reference codes and how we use the code versus this code language. Okay, I've laid out here the code contents just to give you an example. This is in much more detail in the TCM. So all ACI codes, with few exceptions, I shouldn't say all ever, but ACI code requirements have a specific layout of chapters and consistent formatting. If you're starting a new code, find your staff liaison to get a template because it will have all this laid out for you. And all these components need to be provided. Okay, and this talks about not worrying about basic formatting, but each of these code requirements is going to have a general chapter 1, notations and definitions in chapter 2, reference standards in chapter 3, and then chapter 4 and higher are going to give the requirements and order of design, construction, inspection, and commissioning. You may not have all those components, but that's the general order. Appendices are optional. When you're looking at your code provision, this is how the levels work. So I've got a chapter with its name. I've got an article, and it has a heading. As I get into level 3, sections, the heading becomes optional. It depends on what else you have in there. And then subsections, paragraphs, and subparagraphs. You shouldn't be going beyond then, except for in really unusual circumstances. So if you're getting to that, maybe talk with your staff liaison about if you're doing this in the way it was intended. You don't have to have commentary for each provision, and when you include commentary, it has an R before these section numbers. So I know most people realize this, but it's good to just kind of see this outlined. So commentary specific to section 1.1.1 would be labeled R 1.1.1. Okay. So that concludes the high-level overview. And again, from time to time, go read the TCM specifically to get the information about how to write code language. Okay. Summary would be, when you're writing code provisions, use precise language. Every word that you have in there should be necessary and have specific meaning.